Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and mysteries. Tonight, we journey far from here to the ancient lands of Transylvania, where the Carpathian Mountains rise like the spine of a sleeping dragon, and where mist clings to the valleys like the breath of forgotten ages. We will hear of princes and empires, of heroes and monsters, and of how a man became a legend that has never truly died. So settle in close to the fire, pour yourself a cup of something warm, and let us begin our tale in a small mountain village on a night much like this one. The wind had been rising all afternoon, sweeping down from the peaks of the Carpathian Mountains with the promise of a storm. In the village of Brasov, nestled in a valley where the mountains formed a protective embrace, the people had been preparing since midday. Shutters were fastened tight, animals were brought into barns, and mothers called their children inside before the darkness came too early, as it always did when storms gathered in the mountains. The Golden Bear Inn stood at the heart of the village, a sturdy building of thick stone walls and heavy timber beams that had weathered 100 such storms and would weather 100 more. Smoke rose from its wide chimney, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and the promise of warmth within. Above the door, a painted sign showed a great golden bear standing on its hind legs, and the sign creaked and swayed as the wind picked up strength. Inside, the common room glowed with the light of 24 candles and a fire that roared in the wide stone hearth. The walls were hung with woven carpets in rich reds and blues, showing patterns that had been old when the grandfathers of grandfathers were young. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of thyme and lavender, rosemary and sage. Long wooden tables, worn smooth by generations of elbows and cups, stretched across the room, and on them sat plates of bread, wheels of cheese, and clay jugs of wine. Papa Andrei stood behind the long wooden bar, wiping down cups with a cloth, and watching the door with the keen eye of a man who had kept an inn for 40 years. He was a man of perhaps 70 winters, with a face like weathered oak and a beard that was more white than grey, braided in the old style and tied with a leather cord. His eyes were dark and bright, and they missed very little. He wore a vest of embroidered wool over a white shirt, and his sleeves were rolled up to show forearms still strong despite his years. The first travelers had arrived an hour before sunset. A merchant from Budapest with his 2 guards hurrying to reach the next town before the storm hit. They had taken one look at the darkening sky and decided that wisdom was better than speed. Then came a young couple from the north, newlyweds by the look of them, who had been traveling to visit the bride's family in the south. A priest from the monastery in the next valley arrived on his donkey, grateful for shelter, and already crossing himself as thunder rumbled in the distance. Now, as the last light faded from the sky, and the first heavy drops of rain began to strike the windows, the door burst open one final time. A group of travelers stumbled in, shaking water from their cloaks and stamping their boots. There were 5 of them, speaking in a mix of languages that Papa Andrei recognized as German, French, and English. Tourists then come to see the famous castles and mountains of Transylvania. They looked cold and grateful, and slightly afraid, as people often did when caught by mountain storms. Papa Andrei moved quickly as his old legs would carry him, directing them to a table near the fire. His daughter Ilona appeared from the kitchen, a sturdy woman of 40 with her mother's kind face, carrying bowls of hot stew that steamed in the cool air. His grandson Stefan brought cups and a clay jug of heated wine, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, the traditional drink for cold autumn nights. The storm hit in full force as they ate. Rain lashed the windows and wind howled around the eaves of the inn, making a sound like wolves singing to the moon. Lightning flashed, turning the room bright as day for an instant, and thunder followed so close it shook the cups on their tables. The priest made the sign of the cross and murmured a prayer. The young bride pressed close to her husband, and even the merchant's guards looked uneasy. But inside the Golden Bear all was warmth and safety. The fire crackled merrily. The wine was hot and sweet, and the stew was thick with mutton and vegetables, served with fresh bread that Ilona had baked that very afternoon. The travelers began to relax, to talk among themselves, to laugh at their own fear of what was, after all, only weather. Papa Andrei watched them with satisfaction, then caught Ilona's eye and nodded toward the hearth. She smiled and nodded back, understanding without words what he intended. It was a night for stories. It was always a night for stories when strangers gathered at the Golden Bear and the storm sang outside. He moved to the great wooden chair that sat beside the fire, a chair carved with bears and wolves and eagles, a chair that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. As he settled into it with a satisfied grunt, the room gradually fell quiet. Even the tourists who did not know the customs of this place sensed that something was about to happen. "My friends," Papa Andrei said, his voice carrying easily through the room despite being soft and warm as wool. "Welcome to my inn, and welcome to Transylvania. You have chosen an interesting night to be here, with the storm raging outside and the darkness pressing close. But you are safe within these walls, and you have food and wine and fire. What more could any traveler want? Except perhaps a story to pass the time until sleep comes calling, and I think I know which story must be told tonight. For you, tourists have come to Transylvania seeking mysteries, have you not? You have heard the tales told in the West, the stories of vampires and castles and dark magic. You have read the books and heard the rumors, and you wish to see if any of it is true." The German tourist, a young man with spectacles and an earnest face, leaned forward eagerly. Yes, exactly. We have come to see the castle of Dracula, to walk where the vampire walked. Is it true that he really existed? That Count Dracula was real? Papa Andrei smiled, a slow smile that held both sadness and pride. "Ah, my young friend, you asked the right question, but in the wrong way. Was Dracula real? Yes and no. There was a man, and he was indeed called Dracula, but he was no count, and he was certainly no vampire. He was a prince, a warrior, a ruler of these lands in a time of great darkness and danger. His name was Vlad, and his story is far stranger, and more terrible than any tale of vampires. But to understand Vlad, to understand how a man becomes a monster in the minds of the world, you must first understand Transylvania. You must understand these mountains and valleys, these people, this land that has been fought over for 1,000 years by empires that rose and fell like the tides. Outside, lightning flashed again, and in its brief light, the mountains could be seen through the window, dark and jagged against the sky. Thunder rolled like the drums of war. Transylvania, Papa Andrei continued, his voice taking on the cadence of the storyteller, the rhythm that had been passed down through generations. The land of beyond the forest. That is what the name means, you know. Trans means beyond. Silver means forest. The land beyond the forest. And what a forest it was in those days. 500 years ago when Vlad was born. The mountains were covered in trees so thick that a man could walk for days and never see the sky. Wolves ran in packs of 50 or more. Bears the size of horses lived in caves deep in the mountain heights. And in the forest, it was said, lived things older and stranger than wolves or bears. He paused to let this sink in, watching his audience. They were all listening now, even the priest, who had surely heard such tales before but still loved to hear them told. This land, our land, has always been caught between empires. To the west, the kingdom of Hungary, rich and powerful, with its Christian king and its noble knights. To the south and east, the Ottoman Empire, spreading like a shadow across the world with its mighty sultan and its fearsome warriors. And here, in the middle, the principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania itself. Small lands, poor lands, but proud lands. Lands where the people prayed to Christ in the Orthodox way, where they tended their sheep and grew their grain, and tried to live in peace. But peace was rare in those days. The Ottomans wanted our lands as a stepping stone to conquer all of Christian Europe. The Hungarians wanted our lands to make a buffer between themselves and the Ottomans. And we, the people of these mountains and valleys, we wanted only to be left alone to live our lives. But that was not to be. He did, Papa Andrei confirmed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, you must know where he came from, and that story begins in the year 1431. In a town not far from here, a beautiful town called Sighisoara. It sits on a hill, surrounded by walls of stone, with towers that stand like sentries watching the valleys below. In winter, it is covered with snow. In summer, it blooms with gardens. And it was there, in a house that still stands to this day, that a son was born to a man named Vlad II. Stefan had appeared at Papa Andrei's elbow with a fresh cup of heated wine, which the old man accepted with a grateful nod. He took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him, and then continued. Now this Vlad II, he was an important man. He was voivode, which means Prince of Wallachia, the land just south of these mountains. But more than that, he was a member of a special order of knights, an order created to defend Christian Europe from the Ottoman invaders. This order was called the Order of the Dragon. Hey, yes, the Dragon. And because he was a member of this order, Vlad II was called Vlad Dracula. Dracul means dragon in our language, the language of Romania. but it also means something else. It can mean devil. And so the father was called Dracul, the dragon, or the devil. And when his son was born, the boy was called Dracula, the son of the dragon, the son of the devil. Thunder crashed overhead so loud it made the cups rattle on the tables, and the young bride gasped and clutched her husband's arm. Papa Andrei waited for the sound to fade, his eyes twinkling, knowing that the storm itself was helping him tell his tale. The boy grew up in Sigisora, and then in the fortress of Tagoviste, where his father ruled as prince. He had 2 brothers, Mircea and Radu. Mircea was the eldest, strong and brave, his father's favorite. Radu was the youngest, beautiful and gentle, loved by all who met him. And young Vlad, he was the middle son, dark-haired and dark-eyed, clever and proud and fierce even as a child. The boy learned many things in those early years. He learned to ride a horse before he could properly walk. He learned to fight with sword and spear and bow. He learned languages, Latin and Hungarian and Greek, for a prince must speak to many peoples. He learned the ways of politics, the dangerous game of balancing between empires, and he learned about loyalty and betrayal, for in those days one often led to the other. Outside, the rain drummed against the roof, steady and rhythmic, like the beating of a great heart. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, sending up showers of sparks. But most of all, young Vlad learned about his land, about Transylvania and Wallachia, about the mountains and forests, the villages and people. He learned that these lands were beautiful and precious, that they were worth fighting for, worth dying for. He learned that the people here, the shepherds and farmers, the merchants and priests, were good people who deserved to live without fear of invasion and slavery. And he learned that the world was not kind to small nations caught between great empires. He learned that sometimes, to survive, one must make terrible choices. To save the many, one must sacrifice the few. To keep one's land free, one must become harder than one's enemies. These were the lessons that would shape the man he would become. And so we have our beginning. A boy born in a time of war, in a land fought over by empires, to a father who wore the symbol of the dragon and was called by a name that meant both protector and devil. A boy who would grow up to be both hero and monster, defender and destroyer. A man whose name would echo through the centuries as a warning and a legend. This is the story of Vlad Dracula, the Impaler Prince, the defender of Christendom, the terror of the Ottomans. This is the story of how a man becomes a monster, and how sometimes monsters are created by the very people who later fear them. This is a story of blood and honor, of love and betrayal, of a land that has always been beautiful and always been cursed by its beauty. The storm howled outside, but within the Golden Bear Inn there was only the crackle of the fire and the breathing of the listeners, all waiting for Papa Andrei to continue to take them deeper into the past, into the tale of the dragon's son. "But I am getting ahead of myself again," the old man said with a chuckle. "First we must speak of the boy's childhood, and then of the terrible years that followed, years that would forge him like iron in a blacksmith's fire, years that would teach him that kindness is a luxury that the weak cannot afford, He reached for his cup again and took a long, slow sip, giving his audience time to settle, time to prepare themselves for the journey ahead. Outside, the storm raged on, but it would be a long night, and there was much story yet to tell. Papa Andrei settled deeper into his chair, the firelight playing across his weathered face as he gazed into the flames, as though seeing the past written there in the dance of light and shadow. The year was 1431, he began, his voice soft but clear. The same year that a young French girl named Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in France, though few in Transylvania knew or cared about such distant matters. Here, in the fortress town of Sigisora, in the house that bore the sign of the dragon above its door, a child was born on a cold November night. Imagine, if you will, that house. It was not a palace, not a grand castle, but a solid stone building 3 stories high, with thick walls and narrow windows, the kind of house built to keep out both winter cold and uninvited visitors. The lower floor was used for storage and for the guard. The second floor held the main rooms where the family lived, and the third floor had bedchambers and a small chapel. You can still see this house today, young man. It is yellow now, painted bright as sunshine, and it sits on a cobbled street in the old town. Tourists come to take photographs, to stand where Dracula was born, but in 1431 it was simply the home of an ambitious prince and his family. Vlad II, the boy's father, was a complicated man. He had been born a bastard son, which in those days meant he had to fight twice as hard for everything he achieved. But he was clever and brave, and he had earned his place through service to the Hungarian king Sigismund. It was Sigismund who had inducted him into the Order of the Dragon, that secret society of knights sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottomans and all enemies of the cross. The Order of the Dragon was no small thing, my friends. To join it, a man had to prove his courage, his loyalty, and his faith. Members wore a special medallion around their necks, showing a dragon curled into a circle, its tail wrapped around its neck and a cross upon its back. The dragon represented vigilance, for a dragon never sleeps, always watching for danger. The cross represented their Christian duty, beautiful and terrible, Papa Andrei agreed. For those who wore it were marked men. They had sworn an oath to fight the Sultan's armies to their last breath, to defend every inch of Christian soil, to never surrender, never retreat. It was an oath that Vlad II took seriously, and it was an oath that would shape his son's entire life. When young Vlad was born, there were celebrations in Sigisora. Bells rang from the church towers. Wine flowed in the streets. The father had a second son, a spare heir, and this was good fortune indeed. The baby was baptized in the Orthodox faith, though his father dealt with both Orthodox and Catholic clergy, for politics required flexibility in matters of religion. Outside, the storm seemed to be settling into a steady rhythm, no longer the violent assault of earlier, but a persistent drumming that would last through the night. The baby boy had dark hair and dark eyes, and from the very beginning he was serious. Nurses said he rarely cried, but instead watched everything with those dark eyes, taking it all in. His mother, the princess, whose name was lost to history or perhaps deliberately forgotten, loved him fiercely as mothers do. She dressed him in fine clothes, taught him prayers, and held him close during the long winter nights when wolves could be heard howling in the forests beyond the town walls. Young Vlad grew quickly, as mountain children do. By the time he was 3, he could walk the steep streets of Sigashora without stumbling. By 5, he could ride a pony. By 7, he was beginning his education in earnest, for a prince must know many things that common folk need not bother with. He learned Latin from the priests, for that was the language of the church and of educated men. Across Europe, he learned Greek, for his mother's family had connections to the Byzantine Empire. In the east, he learned Hungarian, for the king who gave his father power spoke that tongue. And of course he spoke Romanian, the language of his people, a language descended from the Roman soldiers who had conquered these lands more than 1,000 years before. Oh, he was brilliant, Papa Andrei said with certainty. All the chroniclers agree on this. He had a mind like a trap, catching and holding everything he learned. He could quote scripture by the age of 8. He could calculate numbers and read maps. He understood strategy and politics before most boys understood how to properly hold a sword. But he was not just a scholar. No, he was also trained in all the arts of war. His father made sure of that. By the age of 10, young Vlad could ride a full-sized horse at full gallop. He could fight with a wooden sword, and his instructors said he had a natural talent for it. He was quick and clever, always thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess player. But more than any of these skills, young Vlad learned about the world he lived in, and that world was dark and dangerous indeed. You must understand, my friends, that in those days this part of Europe was like a chessboard, and every piece was in play. The kingdom of Hungary to the west was powerful, but divided by internal quarrels. The Ottoman Empire to the south and east was growing stronger every year, swallowing up Christian kingdoms one by one. And caught in between were the Romanian principalities, Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania, each one trying desperately to survive. Vlad's father, Vlad Dracula, was constantly playing this dangerous game. One year he would swear loyalty to the Hungarian king. The next year he might send tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. It was not cowardice, you understand. It was survival. A small nation cannot stand against either of these empires alone. To survive, one must be clever, must bend like the willow tree in the wind, not break like the proud oak. The merchant from Budapest nodded knowingly. The politics of that time were indeed treacherous. A man could be an ally one day and an enemy the next. Exactly so, Papa Andrei agreed. And young Vlad watched all of this. He saw his father swear oaths that would later be broken. He saw ambassadors arrive with honey on their tongues and poison in their hearts. He learned that in politics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. In 1436, when Vlad was 5 years old, his father finally achieved his great ambition. He became voivode of Wallachia, prince of the land south of the Carpathian Mountains. This was a great victory, but it came at a price. To secure his throne, Vlad Dracula had to make promises to the Hungarian king. he had to agree to pay tribute. He had to allow Hungarian advisors at his court. And most importantly, he had to promise to fight against the Ottoman Turks whenever the king commanded. But the Ottomans also had their eyes on Wallachia. Sultan Murad II, who ruled in Constantinople, demanded his own tribute. He sent his own ambassadors, and he made it very clear that if Vlad Dracula did not cooperate, the Sultan's armies would come north and leave nothing but ashes and bones. The room was very quiet now, except for the crackling of the fire and the patter of rain outside. Everyone was caught up in the story, imagining that long ago time. So Vlad Dracula walked a tightrope between two empires, paying tribute to both, making promises to both, trying to keep his small country independent while both giants wanted to devour it. And his sons, especially young Vlad, watched and learned. They learned that power respects only power, that weakness invites invasion, that mercy can be a luxury that costs lives. The family moved to Targovisti, which was the capital of Wallachia. It was a city of perhaps 10,000 souls, with a great princely court built on a hill overlooking the river. The palace was surrounded by walls and towers, and within those walls, young Vlad and his brothers grew up in an atmosphere of constant intrigue and danger. Mircea, the eldest brother, was being groomed to inherit their father's throne. He was tall and strong, good with weapons, beloved by the boyars, the nobles who held land and power in Wallachia. Radu, the youngest, was different. He was beautiful, with golden hair and gentle eyes. People said he looked like an angel. He was kind and soft-spoken, skilled at music and poetry. And then there was Vlad, the middle son. Not the heir, but not the baby either. He had to make his own place in the world. He was darker than his brothers, in appearance and in temperament. Where Mircea was loud and confident, Vlad was quiet and watchful. Where Radu was gentle, Vlad was hard. He spent hours in the training yard, perfecting his sword work, his archery, his horsemanship. He spent more hours in the library studying military history, learning about the great commanders of the past, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. He had few friends among the other noble children. He did not trust easily, did not laugh often. Even as a boy, he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. The servants whispered that he was too serious, too intense for a child. But Vlad did not care what servants whispered. He cared about becoming strong enough, smart enough, hard enough to survive in a world that showed no mercy to weakness. And all the while, the situation grew worse. The Ottomans pressed harder for tribute, for submission. The Hungarians demanded that Vlad Dracula join their crusade against the Turks. Caught between these demands, the prince struggled to maintain his balance. He paid gold to both sides, promised soldiers to both sides, and prayed that neither would realize he was playing them against each other. But in 1442, when young Vlad was 11 years old, the balance finally broke. The Ottomans had grown tired of Vlad Dracula's evasions. Sultan Murad summoned him to the Ottoman court, supposedly to discuss terms of peace and friendship. It was an invitation that could not be refused without declaring open war, and Vlad Dracula was not ready for such a war. So the prince prepared to go to the Sultan's court. But he knew it was dangerous. He knew the Ottomans did not trust him, had never trusted him. And so he made a choice that would change everything. A choice that would shape his son's future in ways he could never have imagined. He decided to bring his sons with him. Vlad and Radu would accompany their father to the Ottoman Empire. They would see the might and splendor of the Sultan's court. And if things went wrong, if the Sultan decided to punish Vlad Dracula for his divided loyalties, well, having the man's sons as hostages would be useful leverage. Papa Andrei nodded slowly. He did. Whether he knew what would happen, whether he suspected the trap that was being laid, we will never know for certain. But in the spring of 1442, Vlad Dracula and his 2 younger sons set out from Wallachia, traveling south across the Danube River into the lands controlled by the Ottoman Empire, toward the city of Adrianople, where Sultan Murad held his court. Our young Vlad was 11 years old. His brother Radu was just 7. Neither of them knew, as they rode south with their father and his escort of soldiers, that they were riding toward a prison that would last 6 years. 6 years that would teach Vlad lessons in cruelty and survival that no child should ever have to learn. 6 years that would forge him into the man history would remember. The man who would become Dracula. But that, he said, is a tale for the next part of our story. For now, let us remember the boy as he was before those terrible years, a serious child with dark eyes and a clever mind, riding south into the unknown, still innocent enough to believe that his father would protect him, that loyalty meant something, that the world had rules and justice. He would learn differently soon enough. The Ottomans would teach him lessons that would stay with him forever. Lessons about power and cruelty, about survival and revenge. And when those lessons were done, the boy would be gone, replaced by something harder and colder and far more dangerous. The fire crackled and popped, sending up a shower of golden sparks that danced briefly before fading into darkness. Papa Andrei called for more wine, and Stefan hurried to bring a fresh jug, this one heated with honey and orange peel, a sweeter mixture for the deepening night. The old man poured cups for himself and any who wanted, and the warm spice scent filled the common room, mixing with the smell of pine smoke and rain-washed air that leaked through the cracks around the door. Now we come to the hard part of the tale, he said, settling back into his chair with a grimace that might have been from old bones or old memories. The part where the boy's childhood ended and his education in the ways of empires truly began. The journey to Adrianople took many days. First they crossed the Danube, that great river that marks the border between Wallachia and the Ottoman lands. The river was wide and swift, and they crossed on boats, the horses nervous and stamping on the decking. Young Vlad stood at the rail watching his homeland disappear behind him, the green mountains fading into the distance. Then they traveled through Bulgaria, through lands that had once been Christian kingdoms, but now bowed to the Sultan. They saw villages where minarets rose beside church steeples, where the call to Islamic prayer echoed across valleys that had once heard only Christian bells. They saw Ottoman soldiers everywhere, disciplined troops in bright uniforms, janissaries with their tall white hats and curved swords, cavalry on magnificent horses bred for war. Exactly so, father, Papa Andrei said with a nod. The Devonshire system, they called it. Every few years, Ottoman officials would come to Christian villages and select the strongest, smartest boys. These children would be taken to the capital, converted to Islam, and trained as elite soldiers completely loyal to the Sultan. It was a cruel practice, tearing children from their families, but it created the finest soldiers in the world. Young Vlad saw these janissaries and understood what they represented. Power through discipline, loyalty through indoctrination, strength through ruthlessness. He filed these observations away in his clever mind, storing them for future use. Finally, they reached Adrianople, which the Turks called Edirne. It was a magnificent city, far larger than anything Vlad had ever seen. Targoviste, his father's capital, had perhaps 10,000 people. Adrianople had more than 100,000. It stretched across hills and valleys with massive walls of stone, great mosques with their domes and towers reaching toward heaven, markets that sold goods from India and China and Persia, palaces that made the castle at Targoviste look like a farmer's cottage. The Sultan's palace was built on a hill overlooking the river. It had gardens that covered acres with fountains and pools and peacocks that strutted among the roses. The palace buildings were made of white marble and red brick, decorated with tiles in colors more brilliant than any European had ever seen. Blue and green and gold, forming patterns of flowers and stars and verses from the Quran. Vlad Dracula and his sons were received with great ceremony. They were given fine rooms, fed excellent food, treated as honored guests. For 3 days it seemed that all would be well. The Sultan, Murad II, was a man in his 40s, not tall but powerfully built, with a beard gone gray and eyes that missed nothing. He spoke to Vlad Dracula about peace, about cooperation, about the benefits of friendship with the mighty Ottoman Empire. And then, on the 4th day, the trap was sprung. Vlad Dracula was summoned to a private audience with the Sultan. He went expecting to discuss terms of tribute and alliance. Instead, he found himself surrounded by janissaries, their hands on their sword hilts, and the Sultan's face had lost all pretense of friendship. Murad accused Vlad Dracula of treachery, of making secret agreements with the Hungarians, of planning to join a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. These accusations were partly true, for Vlad Dracula had indeed been playing both sides. But now the game was over, and the Sultan held all the pieces. The Sultan gave Vlad Dracula a choice. Not really a choice, but the illusion of one. He could leave, return to Wallachia, and continue his rule. But his sons would remain in Adrianople as, let us say, guests of the Sultan. Hostages to ensure their father's good behavior. If Vlad Dracula kept his promises, paid his tribute, and stayed loyal to the Ottoman Empire, the boys would be treated well, and perhaps return some day. But if he betrayed the Sultan again, the boys would die, and in such a way that would be whispered about for generations. What could a father do? Vlad Dracula agreed to the terms. He had no choice. To refuse would mean immediate death for all of them, and he still had his eldest son Mircea back in Wallachia, still had a throne to protect. So he embraced his two younger sons, told them to be brave, to obey their captors, to remember who they were and where they came from. And then he left, riding north with his escort, leaving 11-year-old Vlad and 7-year-old Radu behind in the gilded prison of the Ottoman court. Imagine being that boy, that serious, dark-eyed 11-year-old, watching your father ride away, knowing you had been left behind, traded like a piece in a chess game. Imagine the anger, the fear, the sense of betrayal. Your father, who was supposed to protect you, had abandoned you to ensure his own survival. This was the moment that shaped everything that came after. This was when young Vlad learned that even those who should love you most will sacrifice you if necessary. That loyalty is a lie told by the powerful to control the weak. That in the end, everyone looks out for themselves and trust is for fools who want to be disappointed. At first, not so badly. They were kept in comfortable rooms in the palace complex. They were fed well, dressed in fine Ottoman clothes. Teachers were brought to instruct them in Turkish, in Arabic, in the Quran and Islamic law. They were expected to learn the ways of the Ottoman court, to understand how the empire functioned. But they were prisoners nonetheless. They could not leave the palace grounds. Guards watched them constantly, and slowly, carefully, the Ottomans began trying to convert them to Islam, to strip away their Christian identity and replace it with Ottoman loyalty. The two brothers reacted very differently to their captivity. Radu, the younger one, the beautiful, gentle boy, he adapted. Perhaps he was too young to hold on to his anger, or perhaps his nature was simply more flexible. He learned Turkish quickly. He made friends among the Ottoman princes. He studied the Quran and found comfort in its verses. Within a year, he had converted to Islam, though whether this was genuine faith or survival instinct, who can say? The Ottomans loved Radu. They called him Radu the Handsome, for he grew into a youth of remarkable beauty. Sultan Murad became fond of him, treated him almost like another son. He was given privileges, allowed to ride in the hunts, to train with the cavalry. Some whispered that he became even closer to the Sultan's son, Prince Mehmed, who would one day become Sultan himself. Whether this closeness was friendship or something deeper, the chronicles do not say clearly, but there were rumors. But Vlad, our Vlad was different. Vlad refused to bend. He learned Turkish because he had to, because understanding your enemy's language is essential. He studied Ottoman military tactics because knowledge is power. But he never converted to Islam, never adopted Ottoman dress willingly, never made friends at the court. He remained stubbornly, defiantly Wallachian, defiantly Christian, defiantly himself. This resistance came at a cost, of course. The Ottomans did not take well to defiance. When Vlad refused to pray at the mosque, he was beaten. When he spoke disrespectfully to his captors, he was locked in a cell for days with no light and little food. When he tried to escape, and he tried several times, the punishments grew more severe. They beat him until he could barely walk. They locked him in rooms where he could not stand upright or lie down comfortably, forced to crouch in agony for hours. They denied him food until he was weak with hunger, and through it all Vlad refused to break. He endured everything they did to him with a cold, silent fury that impressed even his tormentors. He was, Papa Andrei agreed gently, but childhood was ending. With every beating, every punishment, every humiliation, the boy was dying, and the man was being born. A man who would show no mercy because he had been shown none. A man who would trust no one because everyone had proven themselves untrustworthy. A man who would use any means necessary to achieve his goals because he had learned that the only rule in this world is survival. But he also learned other things, useful things. He learned how the Ottoman military machine functioned, how they organized their armies, how they fought. He learned about discipline and logistics, about the importance of morale and the power of terror. He watched how the Sultan governed, how he balanced the competing interests of generals and administrators, how he used both reward and punishment to maintain control. All of this went into that clever mind, stored away for future use. Vlad was like a sponge absorbing everything, learning from his enemies so that one day he might defeat them. He saw how the Janissaries were trained to feel no pity, to follow orders without question. He saw how the Ottomans used impalement as a punishment for serious crimes, mounting criminals on wooden stakes and leaving them to die slowly as a warning to others. He saw how fear could be a weapon as powerful as any sword. The years passed slowly in that gilded prison. Vlad grew from a boy into a young man. His body hardened from the training they forced upon him, for the Ottomans believed that even hostages should be fit and useful. His mind sharpened from constant vigilance, always watching for weakness, always planning, always preparing for the day when he might escape or be released. Meanwhile, his brother Radu flourished in the Ottoman court. He was beloved, admired, successful. Where Vlad was dark and brooding, Radu was bright and charming. Where Vlad made enemies through his defiance, Radu made friends through his compliance. The two brothers grew apart, separated not just by their different responses to captivity, but by the choices they made about who they would become. Sometimes I wonder if Vlad envied his brother, envied how easily Radu adapted, how happy he seemed. Or perhaps he despised him for it, saw him as weak and traitorous for abandoning his Christian faith and Romanian identity. We cannot know what passed between them in those years, what words were spoken in their shared rooms when the guards were not listening. But we know that when they finally left at that place, they left as strangers to each other, bound by blood, but divided by everything else. 6 years they stayed in Adrianople, 6 years of captivity, of lessons learned in pain and humiliation, of watching and waiting and planning. And then, in 1448, news came from Wallachia that would change everything once more. News that would send young Vlad, now 17 years old, on a path toward vengeance and glory and terrible, terrible darkness. His father was dead. Vlad Dracula, the dragon, had been betrayed and murdered by his own nobles, and with him had died Vlad's eldest brother, Mircea. The two people who stood between young Vlad and the throne of Wallachia were gone, removed not by the Ottomans, but by their own people, by the boyars who were supposed to serve them. So there was Vlad, 17 years old, hardened by 6 years of captivity and cruelty, burning with rage at his father's betrayal and now his murder. And the Ottomans, seeing an opportunity, offered him a choice. They would help him take the throne of Wallachia. They would give him an army, support his claim, install him as voivode. In exchange, he would become their loyal servant, a puppet prince who would do whatever the Sultan commanded. Vlad agreed. Of course he agreed. What else could he do? He needed Ottoman support to take his throne. But in his heart, in the dark, secret places where his hatred lived and grew, he was already planning his revenge. Not just against the boyars who had killed his father, but against the Ottomans who had imprisoned him, against everyone who had ever hurt him, or betrayed him, or shown him that the world was nothing but predators and prey. And so the dragon's son prepared to return to his homeland, no longer a boy, but a man, no longer innocent, but knowing, carrying with him lessons in cruelty that would make him famous and infamous for all time. The Ottomans thought they were sending home a loyal servant. They were actually unleashing something far more dangerous. They were sending home a monster of their own creation, one who would haunt them for years to come. The fire had burned low, and Stefan moved to add more logs, sending up a fresh shower of sparks that danced briefly before fading into darkness, like the last remnants of childhood disappearing into the cold reality of a world without mercy. Papa Andrei rose from his chair with a grunt, his old joints protesting the movement. He walked to the window and pushed back the shutter just slightly, letting in a breath of cool night air. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and in the distance, between the clouds, a few stars were beginning to show themselves. He returned to his chair and settled into it once more, and everyone in the room shifted slightly, preparing themselves for the next chapter of the tale. "Let us go back a bit," Papa Andrei said, "to the year 1447, when young Vlad was still imprisoned in Adrianople, still enduring his captivity with that cold, stubborn fury. News traveled slowly in those days, especially news that the Ottomans might wish to control or suppress. So it was weeks, perhaps even months, before Vlad learned what had happened to his father and brother. It happened in December of 1447, in a place called Baltini, near Bucharest. Vlad Dracula, the dragon, the voivode of Wallachia, was attending what he thought was a peace meeting with the boyars, those powerful nobles who controlled much of the land and wealth of the principality. But it was a trap, arranged by rivals who wanted him removed from power. The boyars had grown tired of Vlad Dracula's balancing act between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Some wanted full alliance with Hungary, others preferred to submit to the Ottomans. But all agreed that Vlad Dracula was too independent, too clever, too unwilling to be controlled by any faction, and so they decided to remove him. They ambushed him at the meeting. There are different stories about exactly how it happened. Some say he was struck down while trying to flee. Others say he was betrayed by a man he thought was a friend, stabbed in the back while distracted. What we know for certain is that Vlad Dracula died that day, murdered by his own nobles, and his body was buried in a marsh near the monastery of Tismana. But that was not the worst of it. With the father dead, the eldest son Mircea should have inherited the throne. He was perhaps 20 years old, strong and capable, his father's chosen heir. The boyars could not allow this. If Mircea took power, he would surely avenge his father's murder. And so they moved against him as well. What they did to Mircea was worse than simple murder. They wanted to make an example of him, to show what happened to those who opposed them. They took him to Targoviste, to the burial ground outside the city walls, and there they buried him alive. Ah, yes, Papa Andrei said, his face grim. They dug a deep grave and forced Mircea into it. Then they covered him with earth while he still breathed, while he still screamed and pleaded. They buried him alive and left him there to suffocate in the darkness, to die in terror and agony, knowing that no one was coming to save him. This was the way of the boyars, you understand. It was not enough to kill. They had to humiliate, to terrify, to make such an example that no one would dare challenge them again. They thought this would secure their power. Instead, they created something they would come to fear far more than Vlad Dracula had ever been. When news of these murders finally reached Vlad in Adrianople, he was in the training yard, practicing with a wooden sword against one of the Ottoman instructors. A messenger arrived and spoke quietly to one of the guards, who then approached Vlad and told him that the Sultan wished to see him immediately. Vlad walked through the palace gardens to the Sultan's private chambers, knowing something terrible must have happened. Sultan Murad received him with unusual gentleness, which was itself alarming. The Sultan was not a gentle man. He told Vlad to sit, offered him wine, and then told him that his father and brother were dead, killed by traitors in Wallachia. The chronicles say that Vlad showed no emotion. He sat there in the Sultan's chamber, his face like stone, his dark eyes revealing nothing. He thanked the Sultan for informing him. He asked permission to retire to his rooms to pray for the souls of the dead. And the Sultan, perhaps impressed by this composure or perhaps simply not caring, granted the request. But once Vlad was alone in his chambers, once the door was closed and the guards were outside and could not see him, only then did he allow himself to feel. And what he felt was rage. Rage like a fire that consumes everything in its path. Rage at his father for abandoning him to the Ottomans. Rage at the boyars for their betrayal and murder. Rage at the world for being so cruel and unjust. Rage at God himself for allowing such things to happen. They say he destroyed his room that night, smashed the furniture, tore the curtains, broke everything he could lay hands on. The guards outside heard the sounds but did not dare to enter. They knew that sometimes a man must be allowed his grief, even a prisoner, even a hostage prince. By morning, when the servants came to clean, they found Vlad sitting calmly amid the wreckage, his face composed, his eyes cold and empty. But something had changed in him that night. The last shred of the boy he had been burned away in the fire of his rage. What remained was something harder, colder, more dangerous. He had learned his final lesson from the Ottomans. He had learned that in this world there is only power and the will to use it. Everything else is illusion. Oh yes, Papa Andrei said, with a grim smile. In the privacy of his room, with no witnesses but God and his own dark heart, Vlad swore an oath. He swore that he would return to Wallachia. He swore that he would take the throne that was rightfully his. He swore that he would find every boyar who had participated in his father's murder, and he would make them pay in ways that would make them wish they had never been born. But more than that, he swore that he would never be weak again, never be a victim again, never allow anyone to have power over him again. He would become so strong, so feared, so terrible that no one would dare betray him. And if that meant becoming a monster, if that meant doing things that would make the angels weep and the devils applaud, so be it. Better to be feared than loved. Better to be a living devil than a dead saint. The Ottomans, seeing opportunity in chaos, decided to use Vlad for their own purposes. Wallachia was in turmoil after the murders, with different factions fighting for control. The Ottoman Empire wanted a puppet on the Wallachian throne, someone who would be loyal to them and do their bidding. They thought young Vlad, who had spent 6 years in their custody, would be perfect for this role. How wrong they were. But they did not know it yet. To them, Vlad was just a useful tool, a bitter young man who wanted revenge and would do anything to get it. And so, in 1448, when Vlad was 17 years old, the Ottomans gave him an army and sent him north to take the throne of Wallachia. Imagine that journey. Vlad, who had been a prisoner just weeks before, now riding at the head of an Ottoman army, crossing the Danube into Wallachia, seeing his homeland for the first time in 6 years, the mountains in the distance, the forest he had played in as a child, the villages where people spoke his language and prayed to his God. It must have been both wonderful and terrible, coming home as an invader, leading the armies of the empire that had imprisoned him. Papa Andrei shook his head. Some did, especially those who had been loyal to his father. But many did not. They saw him as an Ottoman puppet, a traitor who had sold himself to the Sultan for a crown. The boyars who had killed his father now rallied behind a different candidate for the throne, a man named Vladislav II, who had the support of the Hungarian king. And so Vlad found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, fighting the boyars who had murdered his father, fighting the Hungarian-backed rival for the throne, fighting his own reputation as an Ottoman stooge. It was a mess, a confused tangle of loyalties and betrayals, the kind of political chaos that Wallachia specialized in. His first reign lasted just 2 months. 2 months of desperate fighting, of trying to secure his position, of attempting to win over the boyars and the people. But he was too young, too inexperienced, and he had too many enemies. Vladislav II, backed by Hungarian troops, drove Vlad out of Wallachia by the end of the year. Vlad barely escaped with his life, fleeing across the mountains with just a handful of loyal followers. This was perhaps the lowest point of Vlad's life. He was 18 years old. His father and brother were dead. His other brother Radu was still with the Ottomans, having fully embraced his new life there. Vlad himself was a prince without a principality, a ruler without a realm, a young man with nothing but his anger and his cleverness and his iron determination to succeed. But he did not give up. That was never in his nature. Instead, he began a period of wandering, of exile that would last for 8 years. 8 years during which he would learn the final lessons he needed to become the ruler he was destined to be. First, he went to Moldavia, the principality to the northeast of Wallachia, ruled by his cousin Bogdan. There he stayed for a time, living at Bogdan's court, training with Moldavian soldiers, learning about governance and warfare from a perspective outside Wallachia. He saw how Bogdan maintained his independence by playing the powers against each other, and he filed these lessons away. Then, when Bogdan was assassinated in his turn, because that is how things went in those lands, Vlad moved on to Hungary. Yes, the very kingdom that had supported his rival. But politics makes strange bedfellows, and the Hungarian governor of Transylvania, a man named John Hunyadi, saw potential in the young exile. The very same, Papa Andrei said with a smile. But Hunyadi was first and foremost a crusader against the Ottomans. He had spent his entire life fighting the Sultan's armies, and he recognized in young Vlad someone who hated the Ottomans as much as he did, someone who had learned their ways and could use that knowledge against them. The enemy of my enemy, as they say. For 6 years, Vlad lived in Transylvania, sometimes at Hunyadi's fortress in Hunadora, sometimes in other places, always moving, always careful. During this time, he learned Hungarian military tactics. He observed how Hunyadi organized his forces, how he used cavalry and infantry, how he fortified positions and conducted sieges. He made connections with Hungarian nobles, with merchants, with priests. He built a network of allies and supporters. But most importantly, he learned patience. He learned to wait for the right moment, to build his strength slowly, to prepare thoroughly before making his move. The hot-headed 17-year-old who had rushed to take the throne and failed was gone. In his place was a 25-year-old man who knew how to plan, how to wait, how to strike when the time was right. And during all this time, he never forgot his oath, the oath he had sworn in his chamber in Adrianople, the oath of vengeance against those who had killed his father and brother. He kept a list of names, the boyars who had participated in the murders, and he memorized that list. Every night before sleep, he would recite the names silently, like a prayer, like a promise. One day he would find them. One day he would make them pay. Thunder rumbled one last time, very distant now. And then there was only the sound of the rain, much lighter now, barely a whisper against the windows. In 1456, 8 years after his first failed attempt at ruling, Vlad's opportunity finally came. John Hunyadi died of plague after a battle with the Ottomans. Vladislav II, who had been ruling Wallachia, made the mistake of switching his allegiance back to the Ottoman side. And the Hungarian nobility, needing a new ally in Wallachia, remembered the exiled prince who had spent years at their court. They gave Vlad an army. They gave him gold. They gave him their blessing. And in the summer of 1456, Vlad marched into Wallachia at the head of a Hungarian force, ready to take what he believed was rightfully his. He was 25 years old, hardened by 8 years of exile and wandering, carrying within him all the lessons he had learned from Ottomans and Hungarians and his own bitter experience. This time, there would be no failure. This time, he would not be driven out after 2 months. This time, he would take the throne and hold it with an iron grip. This time, he would show the Boyars and the Ottomans and everyone else who had underestimated him exactly what the dragon's son could do when he finally stopped holding back. And so begins the reign of Vlad III, Vlad Dracula, the Impaler Prince, the Scourge of the Turks, the Defender of Christendom, the Terror of the Boyars. So begins the reign of the man who would become a legend, a monster, a hero, depending on who was telling the story. So begins the blood and the darkness and the terrible glory. The fire had burned down to coals, glowing red and orange in the hearth, casting strange shadows on the walls. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the soft patter of rain and the occasional drip of water from the eaves. But that, he said softly, is a story for after we have rested a moment. Stefan, bring more wood for the fire. Ilona, perhaps some bread and cheese for those who are hungry. We have much more tale to tell before the night is done, and I find that dark stories are best told with a full belly and a warm fire. And so they paused in the telling, though the story hung in the air like smoke, waiting to continue. Stefan brought fresh logs for the fire, and soon the flames were leaping high again, casting dancing light across the common room. Ilona emerged from the kitchen with a tray of bread, still warm from the oven, along with wheels of cheese and sliced sausage. The travelers ate gratefully, and Papa Andrei allowed them this moment of comfort before continuing his tale. "Now," he said, his voice filling the room once more, "now we come to the heart of the story, the return of the dragon's son, the beginning of a reign that would last 6 years and would echo through the centuries. And in the late summer of 1456, Vlad entered Wallachia with his Hungarian-backed army. His rival Vladislav II tried to resist, but his support had crumbled. The Boyars who had once backed him now saw which way the wind was blowing and began to switch their allegiance. Some fled across the border. Others sent secret messages to Vlad, offering their loyalty if he would spare their lives and lands. Vlad accepted none of these offers. Not yet. He had learned patience during his years of exile, but he had not forgotten his oath of vengeance. First he would secure the throne, then he would deal with those who had betrayed his father. The final battle took place near Targovist, the capital. It was a short, brutal affair. Vladislav II fought bravely, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By the end of the day, he lay dead on the field, and Vlad entered the capital in triumph. The dragon's son had returned, and this time, no one would drive him out. Targoviste in those days was a city of perhaps 15,000 souls. It sat on a hill above the Ialomita River, surrounded by wooden palisades and earthen ramparts. Not as grand as the great cities of the West or the Ottoman capitals, but impressive enough for a Romanian principality. The princely court dominated the highest part of the hill, a complex of buildings surrounded by stone walls. There was a great hall for feasting and councils, A chapel for prayers, barracks for soldiers, storerooms, stables, and the prince's private chambers. Below the court, the city spread out in a maze of narrow streets and wooden houses. There was a market square where merchants sold grain and livestock, cloth and tools. There were workshops for blacksmiths and potters, tanners and weavers. Churches stood at intervals, their bells marking the hours of prayer. And around it all, the common people went about their lives, trying to survive in a world that cared little for their struggles. When Vlad rode through the gates of Targoviste that first time as prince, the people lined the streets to see him. They had heard stories about him, the exiled prince who had returned to claim his throne. Some cheered, hoping for a strong ruler who would protect them from the Ottomans and bring order to the chaos. Others watched in silence, wary and uncertain, wondering what kind of man this was who had spent 6 years as an Ottoman prisoner and 8 years in Hungarian exile. They would soon find out. Vlad wasted no time in establishing his authority. Within days of taking power, he issued his first proclamations. All lands and titles granted during Vladislav's reign were declared null and void. All officials appointed by the previous regime were dismissed. The treasury was to be audited, the army reorganized, the fortifications strengthened. Hush, Papa Andrei agreed. But Vlad believed that half measures would only invite disaster. He had seen what happened when a ruler was weak, when he tried to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. His father had tried to balance between empires and had been murdered for his trouble. Vlad would not make the same mistake. But the real test came at Easter of 1457. This is one of the most famous stories about Vlad, and it shows both his cunning and his ruthlessness. Let me tell it properly, for it is important to understand what he did and why. Easter Sunday is the most important feast day in the Orthodox calendar, the celebration of Christ's resurrection from the dead. In Targoviste, as in all Christian cities, it was a time of great celebration. The churches were packed with worshippers. Bells rang from every tower. After the long fasting of Lent, there would be feasting and drinking, music and dancing. Vlad sent out invitations to all the boyars, all the noble families of Wallachia, inviting them to a great Easter feast at the princely court. It would be a celebration, he said, a chance for old wounds to heal, for the new prince to show goodwill to his nobles. Many of the boyars were suspicious, but they could not refuse such an invitation without insulting the prince. And so they came, dressed in their finest clothes, their wives and children with them, thinking they were going to a feast. The great hall of the court had been decorated magnificently. Tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted meats and fresh bread, vegetables and fruits, wine and mead. Musicians played in the gallery. Servants hurried back and forth with platters and cups. Vlad sat at the high table dressed in rich robes, smiling and welcoming his guests as they arrived. The feast began with prayers, as was proper. Then the eating and drinking started in earnest. The boyars relaxed, thinking perhaps their fears had been foolish. The wine flowed freely. Conversations grew loud and merry. Children ran between the tables, laughing and playing. And then, when the feast was at its height, when everyone was comfortable and unsuspecting, Vlad stood up. The hall fell silent. He began to speak, and what he said made the blood drain from every boyar's face. He asked them a question, a simple question. How many princes of Wallachia can you remember? The boyars looked at each other nervously. Some began to count on their fingers. 7, said one. No, 10, said another. More than that, said a third. The truth was that in the past 50 years, Wallachia had seen more than 30 different rulers, each one rising to power through betrayal and murder, each one lasting only a few years before being overthrown or killed. And Vlad looked at them all, these nobles in their fine clothes, and he said, "Do you know why we have had so many princes? It is because of you, because you boyars kill one prince when he displeases you, then support another until he too displeases you. You are like locusts devouring the land. You are like vipers, striking at anyone who tries to bring order. You are the reason Wallachia is weak. You are the reason the Ottomans think they can treat us like slaves." Then Vlad asked another question. How many of you were involved in the murder of my father and brother? No one spoke. No one moved. But Vlad had his list, the list of names he had memorized during his years of exile. He began to read the names aloud. As each name was called, soldiers stepped forward and seized that boyar, dragging him away from the table despite his protests and pleas. When all the guilty had been seized, Vlad gave his judgment. The older boyars, the ones who had actually struck the blows or given the orders, they would die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but in a way that would serve as a warning to all who might think of betraying their prince. They would be impaled, mounted on wooden stakes outside the city walls, left to die slowly over the course of days while the city watched. But the younger boyars, the sons and nephews and cousins who had not directly participated but had benefited from the murders, they received a different punishment. Vlad ordered them and their families to be stripped of their fine clothes right there in the hall. Then they were marched out of the city, given tools, and commanded to walk north into the mountains. Their destination was a place called Poyanari, where the ruins of an old fortress stood on a cliff high above the Argus River. Vlad ordered these noble families to rebuild that fortress with their own hands, to carry stones and mix mortar, to haul timbers and dig foundations, to work like common laborers, like peasants, until the fortress was complete. Many died from the labor. Many more were broken in spirit, their pride shattered along with their soft hands. This became known as the Easter Feast of 1457, and it accomplished several things at once. First, it avenged Vlad's father and brother. Second, it broke the power of the old boyar families who had made Wallachia ungovernable. Third, it sent a clear message to everyone in the realm. The new prince would not tolerate betrayal, would not show mercy to traitors, would not hesitate to use the most extreme measures to maintain order. Papa Andrei nodded slowly. A fair question, Father, and one that people have debated for 500 years. Vlad would have said that in a world where entire families rise and fall together, where sons inherit their father's loyalties and grudges, you cannot punish one man without considering his clan. If you kill the father but leave the sons alive and powerful, they will surely seek revenge. Better to break the entire family, to leave them no resources for vengeance. Oh, whether this was justice or tyranny, I cannot say. Perhaps it was both, but it worked. After the Easter feast, no boyar dared to openly challenge Vlad's authority. They might hate him, might fear him, might plot against him in secret, but they did not dare to act. With the boyars cowed, Vlad turned his attention to the other problems plaguing his realm. Wallachia had become a haven for thieves and murderers, people who knew that the weak government could not catch them. Merchants were regularly robbed on the roads. Peasants had their livestock stolen. Churches were broken into and sacred vessels taken. Vlad decided this would end. He issued a proclamation. Any act of theft, no matter how small, would be punished by impalement. Any act of dishonesty, any lie told to a royal official, any attempt to cheat in the marketplace would be punished by impalement. Any crime of violence, any murder or assault would be punished by impalement. Excessive, yes, Papa Andrei agreed, but also effective. Within months, crime in Wallachia had nearly disappeared. Merchants could travel the roads without fear. Peasants could leave their tools in the fields overnight and find them still there in the morning. A merchant from the west wrote in his journal that he had left a bag of gold coins in the main square of Targoviste as a test, and when he returned 3 days later, the bag was still there, untouched. No one dared to steal it. Vlad even had a golden cup placed at a public well in Targoviste. Anyone could drink from it, but no one was allowed to take it away. That cup remained at that well for years, and no one ever stole it, though it was made of pure gold and worth a fortune. The people were simply too terrified to risk Vlad's punishment. Now, was this justice or terror? Again, it depends on who you ask. The merchants and craftsmen, the farmers and shepherds, they loved Vlad for this. For the first time in generations, they could go about their business without fear of being robbed or killed. They could keep the fruits of their labor instead of having it stolen by bandits or corrupt officials. To them, Vlad was a hero, a protector, the strong father who kept the wolves at bay. But the criminals, the corrupt officials, the boyars who had grown rich through theft and extortion, they hated him. They whispered that he was a monster, a madman who took pleasure in cruelty. And perhaps there was some truth to this. Perhaps Vlad did take a certain satisfaction in punishing those who he saw as parasites on society. Perhaps his time as an Ottoman prisoner had taught him to see cruelty as a tool, no different from a sword or a law. Vlad also reformed the army, creating a force of professional soldiers loyal to him personally, rather than to their boyar lords. He built fortresses along the borders, preparing for the inevitable conflict with the Ottomans. He reorganized the tax system, ensuring that the money went to the state rather than into the pockets of corrupt collectors. He supported the Orthodox Church, building monasteries and endowing them with land, knowing that the church could be a powerful ally. And he created a cult of fear, around his own person. Stories spread throughout Wallachia and beyond about his punishments, each story more terrible than the last. Some were true, some were exaggerated, and some were complete fabrications. But Vlad did nothing to stop these stories. He understood that fear is a weapon, that a reputation for ruthlessness can be more powerful than any army. So there he was, Vlad Dracula, the Impaler Prince, ruling Wallachia with an iron fist. To his own people, at least the common people, he was a hero who brought order and justice. To the boyars, he was a tyrant who had to be endured. And to the outside world, he was becoming something else entirely. A monster, a devil, a creature of nightmare. But the greatest test was still to come. For in Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who had been young Vlad's companion during his captivity, was watching the situation in Wallachia with growing anger. The Sultan expected Vlad to be his loyal servant, his puppet prince. Instead, Vlad was acting independently, building his strength, defying Ottoman authority. And Mehmed, who had just conquered Constantinople itself, who had ended the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, who commanded the most powerful army in the world, decided that this little Romanian prince needed to be taught a lesson in power and in the price of defiance. But Vlad was not the boy who had been imprisoned in Adrianople. He was not the uncertain youth who had been driven from the throne after 2 months. He was a man now, hardened by suffering and exile, cunning and ruthless and utterly determined. And he would not bow to the Sultan. He would not submit. He would not go quietly into slavery. Instead, he would fight. He would take on the might of the Ottoman Empire with nothing but his small principality and his iron will. And in doing so, he would create the legend that has lasted 500 years, the legend of Dracula, the dragon's son, the impaler, the defender of Christendom, the vampire who would not die. The fire blazed high, casting strange shadows on the walls, and outside the wind picked up again, howling around the eaves of the Golden Bear Inn like wolves singing a song of war and blood and dark glory. Papa Andrei paused to refill his cup, and the room remained silent, waiting for him to continue. The wind outside had indeed picked up again, though not with the violence of earlier. It was a steady, persistent wind now, the kind that speaks of autumn settling into winter, of darkness drawing closer. The conflict between Vlad and the Ottoman Empire did not happen all at once, Papa Andrei began, his voice measured and thoughtful. It built slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. First there were small provocations, tests of will, each side pushing to see how far the other would bend. Sultan Mehmed II was no fool. He had conquered Constantinople in 1453, achieving what generations of sultans before him had failed to do. He had ended the Byzantine Empire and made the great city his own capital. Now he dreamed of conquering all of Europe, of planting the banner of Islam on the walls of Rome itself. But to reach the heart of Europe, he first had to secure his northern flank. He had to control the Romanian principalities, Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania. In 1459, 3 years into Vlad's reign, Mehmed sent ambassadors to Targoviste. They came with greetings and gifts, but also with demands. The Sultan required an annual tribute of 10,000 gold ducats. He required 500 young boys to be sent to Constantinople for the Janissary Corps, and as a sign of respect, he required that Vlad come to the Ottoman court to pay homage personally. Exactly, Papa Andrei confirmed, and Vlad knew what had happened to his father when he obeyed such summons. He knew that if he went to Constantinople, he would likely never return. So he refused, politely at first, saying that the tribute was too high, that Wallachia was still recovering from years of war and could not afford such payments. He sent counter-proposals trying to negotiate, buying time while he prepared for the inevitable conflict. The ambassadors returned to Constantinople with Vlad's refusal, and Mehmed was not pleased. He sent a second embassy, this one with a sterner message. The tribute was not negotiable. The boys were not negotiable. Vlad's presence at the Ottoman court was not negotiable. These were not requests but commands, and disobedience would have consequences. There are different stories about what happened next. Some say Vlad received the second embassy with courtesy, but still refused their demands. Others say he flew into a rage and had the ambassadors executed on the spot. The most famous story says that when the Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming it was against their custom, Vlad had their turbans nailed to their heads so they would never have to take them off again. Whether this story is true or not, we cannot know for certain, but it spread throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire, and it accomplished what Vlad intended. It showed that he would not be intimidated, that he feared neither the Sultan's power nor his wrath. Mehmed's response was inevitable. In the spring of 1462, he gathered an army such as the world had rarely seen. Chroniclers say it numbered more than 100,000 men, though this was likely an exaggeration. More realistic estimates put it at perhaps 60,000, but even this was an overwhelming force. There were Janissaries with their guns and bows, cavalry on swift horses, engineers with their siege equipment, and thousands of irregular troops drawn from across the empire. Against this vast army, Vlad had perhaps 30,000 men at most, and many of these were peasant levies, farmers given spears and told to fight. His professional soldiers, the core of his army, numbered no more than 10,000. In a straight battle on an open field, Vlad would be crushed within hours. That is what most princes would have done, Papa Andrei agreed. But Vlad was not most princes. He had learned warfare from the Ottomans themselves. He knew their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses, and he had a plan. A desperate, dangerous plan that would either save Wallachia or see it destroyed utterly. Vlad knew he could not meet the Ottomans in open battle, so he would not give them an open battle. Instead, he would wage a war of terror and attrition. He would use every trick, every cruel tactic he had learned during his captivity and his years of exile. He would turn his own land into a nightmare for the invaders. As the Ottoman army crossed the Danube and marched north into Wallachia, they found nothing. No army waiting to oppose them, no cities prepared for siege, just emptiness. Vlad had ordered the entire southern part of Wallachia evacuated. The people had fled north with their livestock and portable goods. The villages had been burned so the Ottomans could not use them for shelter. The wells had been poisoned or filled with earth. The fields had been set ablaze, the crops destroyed. Everything that could not be carried away had been destroyed. The Ottoman army marched through a wasteland. Where they expected to find food, they found ashes. Where they expected to find water, they found poisoned wells. Where they expected to find guides and informants, they found silence. The land itself had become their enemy. But Vlad did more than just create a wasteland. He waged a war of constant harassment. His soldiers, who knew every path and hiding place in these lands, would strike without warning. A supply column would be ambushed and destroyed. An Ottoman camp would be raided in the night. Tents set ablaze, sentries killed. Foraging parties would disappear. Their bodies found days later, impaled on stakes as a warning. Vlad showed the Ottomans no mercy because they had shown him none during his captivity. Every prisoner was killed in creative and terrible ways. Their bodies left where the Ottoman army would find them. Some were impaled, some were burned alive, some were skinned or broken on wheels, or subjected to tortures so cruel that I will not describe them in detail. The point was always the same: to spread terror, to make the Ottoman soldiers afraid to sleep, afraid to stray from their camps, afraid of the darkness and what might be lurking in it. Sultan Mehmed pressed on, determined to reach Targoviste and crush this impudent prince once and for all. But with every mile north, his army grew weaker. Supplies ran low. Disease began to spread through the camps, worsened by the poisoned water and the bodies of the dead that Vlad left in the Ottomans' path. Morale plummeted as soldiers whispered that they were marching through hell itself. And then came the night attack, the moment that would make Vlad famous throughout Christendom and would cement his reputation as a warrior of legendary cunning and courage. It was June of 1462. The Ottoman army had finally reached the outskirts of Targoviste, though the city itself had been partially evacuated and fortified. Sultan Mehmed had set up his main camp in a valley, with his tent at the center surrounded by thousands of soldiers. He believed he was safe, protected by his vast numbers, by his elite janissaries, by the discipline and training of his troops. But on the night of June 17th, as the moon rose full and bright over the valley, Vlad launched his most daring gambit. He took his best cavalry, perhaps 7,000 riders, men who had trained with him for years, who trusted him absolutely, who were willing to die for him, and he led them in a charge straight into the heart of the Ottoman camp. They struck just after midnight, when most of the Ottoman soldiers were asleep. Vlad's cavalry thundered down from the hills, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound until the last moment. They crashed through the outer guards before any alarm could be raised. Then they were among the tents, slashing and stabbing, setting fires, creating chaos and confusion in the darkness. The Wallachian riders knew exactly where they were going. Vlad had sent scouts days before, men who had infiltrated the Ottoman camp disguised as Turkish soldiers, who had marked the location of the Sultan's tent with subtle signs that only Vlad's men would recognize. The entire attack was aimed at one goal: to reach Mehmed's tent and kill the Sultan himself. They almost succeeded. Vlad's cavalry fought their way through the Ottoman camp, leaving a trail of death and fire behind them. They reached the area where the Sultan's tent should have been, but at the last moment, in the confusion and darkness, they struck the wrong tent. Instead of the Sultan, they killed one of his generals. Mehmed himself was in a different part of the camp, roused by the alarm, surrounded by his elite guards. The Wallachian cavalry fought for hours, trapped now in the middle of a vast enemy force that was rallying and surrounding them. But Vlad had prepared for this. He had studied the layout of the camp, planned multiple escape routes. As dawn approached, he gave the signal to withdraw, and his cavalry broke free, fighting their way back out of the camp and disappearing into the hills before the Ottomans could organize a pursuit. The night attack was a strategic failure in that it did not kill the Sultan, but it was a psychological victory beyond measure. Vlad had proven that even the mighty Ottoman army was not invincible. He had struck at their very heart, had come within yards of killing the Sultan himself. The Ottoman soldiers, who had believed themselves safe in their vast numbers, now knew that nowhere was safe, that the Wallachian devil could strike at any time. But more than this, the attack bought time. Mehmed, shaken by how close he had come to death, became more cautious. His advance slowed. He spent days fortifying his camps, increasing his guards, sending out larger scouting parties, and all this time his army continued to weaken from disease and hunger and the constant harassment by Vlad's forces. Then came the moment that would become the most infamous image associated with Vlad Dracula. As the Ottoman army finally approached Targoviste, they saw something that made even the bravest soldiers quail. Outside the city, in a field that stretched for nearly a mile, was a forest of stakes, and on those stakes were mounted the bodies of more than 20,000 people. Some were Ottoman prisoners captured in earlier battles. Some were Wallachian criminals and traitors. Some were Turkish merchants and settlers who had lived in southern Wallachia. Men, women, even children, all impaled on wooden stakes, their bodies in various states of decay. Some had been there for weeks, some for just days. The sight was overwhelming, the smell unbearable. This was the forest of the impaled, and it was Vlad's final message to the Sultan. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who invade my land. This is what happens to those who oppose me. I am not afraid to use any means, no matter how terrible, to defend my realm. And if you continue this invasion, there will be more forests like this one. Many more. The effect on the Ottoman army was devastating. Soldiers who had survived years of warfare, who had conquered cities and fought in dozens of battles, broke down weeping at the sight. Some became sick from the smell and the horror. Others deserted, slipping away in the night despite the harsh penalties for desertion in the Ottoman army. Even the Sultan himself, hardened warrior that he was reportedly shaken by the sight. And here we see the terrible paradox of Vlad Dracula. Was this an act of monstrous cruelty, the work of a man who had lost all humanity? Or was it a brilliant strategic move by a desperate prince trying to save his people from conquest and slavery? Was Vlad a monster or a hero? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps in that time and place, with those stakes and those choices, one had to be both to survive. Sultan Mehmed held a council with his generals. The army was sick and hungry. Supplies were running dangerously low. The summer campaign season was nearly over, and ahead of them lay Targoviste, fortified and defended, and beyond that the Carpathian Mountains, where Vlad could continue his guerrilla war indefinitely. The cost of conquering Wallachia was becoming too high. And so, in one of the great surprises of that age, Sultan Mehmed, conqueror of Constantinople, master of the most powerful empire in the world, made the decision to withdraw. He turned his vast army around and marched back south, back across the Danube, back to Ottoman territory. He left a smaller force to install Vlad's brother Radu on the throne, hoping that Radu, who had been raised as an Ottoman and was loyal to the Sultan, could succeed where force had failed. But the withdrawal of the Ottoman army was seen throughout Christian Europe as a miracle. Little Wallachia, with its small army and its ruthless prince, had stood against the might of the Ottoman Empire and had not been crushed. Vlad became a hero, praised in sermons and pamphlets from Rome to London. He was called the athlete of Christ, the defender of the faith, the hammer of the Turks. His cruelty was either ignored or justified as necessary measures against a merciless enemy. What they did not know, what Vlad himself perhaps did not fully understand yet, was that his victory was only temporary. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Ottomans would not forget this humiliation. Radu, his own brother, was now gathering forces to challenge him, and the cost of the campaign, the destroyed lands, the dead soldiers, the empty treasury, would weaken Wallachia for years to come. Vlad had saved his country from conquest, but in doing so he had sown the seeds of his own fall. The methods he had used, the cruelties he had committed, the terror he had spread, all of this would come back to haunt him. The dragon had defended his nest with fire and blood, but sometimes the fire burns everything, including what you are trying to protect. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the inn, and the fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. Stefan moved quietly around the room, trimming the candles and adding oil to the lamps. The night was deepening, but no one in the Golden Bear Inn showed any sign of wanting to sleep. They were all caught in Papa Andrei's tale, waiting to hear how the story of the dragon's son would end. The years following the Ottoman invasion were perhaps the most bitter of Vlad's life. He had achieved the impossible, driving back the Sultan's army, saving his country from conquest. He should have been triumphant, secure on his throne, honored by his people. Instead, he found himself fighting enemies on all sides, betrayed by those he should have been able to trust. The problem was that Vlad had made too many enemies and not enough friends. The boyars hated him for what he had done at the Easter feast, for breaking their power and humiliating their families. The Ottomans hated him for his defiance and the humiliation of Mehmed's withdrawal. Even the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, who should have been Vlad's ally in the fight against the Ottomans, had grown suspicious of this fierce prince who seemed to recognize no authority but his own. And then there was Radu, Vlad's own brother, the beautiful one, the one who had adapted so well to Ottoman captivity. Sultan Mehmed gave Radu an army and orders to take the throne of Wallachia. Radu, who had grown up beside Vlad, who knew his brother's tactics and strategies, who could speak to the Wallachian people as one of their own, was in many ways the perfect weapon to use against Vlad. Yes, Papa Andrei agreed softly. It was like something from the old Greek tragedies. Two brothers, raised together, torn apart by captivity and circumstance, now fighting for the same throne. Radu claimed he was bringing peace and cooperation with the Ottomans. Vlad claimed he was defending Wallachia's independence. Both believed they were right. Both were willing to kill for their beliefs. The civil war that followed was bitter and destructive. Radu's forces, backed by Ottoman gold and supplies, began winning over the war-weary Wallachian people. Many were tired of fighting, tired of the terror, tired of watching their fields burn and their sons die. Radu promised them peace, prosperity, an end to the constant warfare. And slowly, steadily, support for Vlad began to crumble. By late 1462, just months after his great victory against Mehmed, Vlad was in serious trouble. Radu controlled much of southern Wallachia. The boyars who remained in Vlad's territory were plotting against him. His treasury was empty, his army depleted and exhausted. He sent desperate messages to King Matthias of Hungary, begging for support, for troops, for supplies. Matthias sent promises but little actual help. And then came the final betrayal, the one that would end Vlad's reign and begin his transformation into legend. In November of 1462, Vlad traveled to Transylvania to meet with King Matthias, hoping to convince the king to honor his promises of support. But when he arrived, he found not an ally but a trap. Matthias had received letters, supposedly written by Vlad, in which the Wallachian prince offered to betray the Christian cause and ally with the Ottomans. These letters were forgeries, obvious forgeries to anyone who looked carefully, but Matthias chose to believe them, or perhaps he simply found them convenient, an excuse to remove a prince who had become too independent, too troublesome, too powerful. Papa Andrei smiled sadly. Politics, my dear. Always politics. Matthias had been receiving money from the Pope to fund a crusade against the Ottomans, but instead of fighting, he had spent the money on other things. If Vlad remained free, he might expose this fraud. Better to imprison Vlad, claim he was a traitor, and thus justify not sending help to Wallachia. So Vlad was arrested and imprisoned in Hungary. Not in a dungeon, for he was still a prince and there were formalities to observe, but imprisoned nonetheless, held in a tower in Visegrad, north of Buda. He was 31 years old. He had ruled Wallachia for 6 years, and now, for the second time in his life, he found himself a prisoner, betrayed by those who should have been his allies. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, Radu took the throne with Ottoman backing. He would rule for more than a decade, maintaining peace with the Sultan, rebuilding the country Vlad had devastated in his defense of it. Some say Radu was a good ruler, gentle and wise. Others say he was a puppet, doing whatever the Ottomans commanded. Perhaps both are true. But while Radu ruled Wallachia and Vlad sat in his Hungarian prison, something else was happening. Something that would echo through the centuries. Stories about Vlad were spreading across Europe, carried by merchants and soldiers, priests and diplomats. And these stories were growing darker and more terrible with each retelling. You must understand, this was the age of the printing press. For the first time in history, stories could be mass-produced and distributed widely. And the printers of Germany and Austria discovered that stories about Vlad Dracula sold very well indeed. People loved to be shocked and horrified by tales of the cruel prince from the East. So pamphlets began to appear, cheap books with woodcut illustrations showing Vlad committing various atrocities. Some of thy stories were based on truth. The impalement of prisoners, the Easter feast, the forest of the impaled, these things had actually happened, but the pamphlets exaggerated everything, added invented details, made Vlad into a monster of almost supernatural evil. One pamphlet claimed that Vlad had a man impaled because his shirt was too short, that he had forced a mother to eat her own child, that he had nailed horseshoes to a man's feet because he was traveling on foot and therefore must be a horse. Another claimed he enjoyed eating meals among the impaled, that he dipped his bread in their blood, that he laughed at their suffering. Some were, Papa Andrei agreed. Some were exaggerations of things that might have happened. And some, who knows? Vlad was certainly capable of great cruelty. But the point is that these pamphlets were not really about Vlad the man. They were about creating an image, a cautionary tale, a monster that could be pointed to as an example of what happens when a ruler loses his humanity. There was another reason these pamphlets were popular in Germany. You see, Vlad's enemies, including King Matthias, needed to justify imprisoning him. What better way than to spread stories of his supposed atrocities? If Vlad was a monster, then Matthias was a hero for removing him from power. Never mind that Matthias had betrayed his own ally. Never mind that he had used forged letters as evidence. The stories made Vlad guilty in the court of public opinion. Vlad spent 12 years in Hungarian captivity. 12 years in a tower, watching the seasons change, growing older, growing harder still. But he was not forgotten. Some still saw him as a hero, a defender of Christendom who had been unjustly imprisoned. There were calls for his release, diplomatic pressure from various quarters, and eventually politics shifted again, as it always does. King Matthias needed an ally in Wallachia, for Radu had died, and the succession was in question. Who better than Vlad, the fierce warrior who had once driven back the Ottomans? So in 1474, Vlad was released from imprisonment. There were conditions, of course. He had to convert from Orthodox to Catholic Christianity, showing submission to Rome. He had to marry a Hungarian noblewoman, creating ties to the Hungarian court. He had to promise to be loyal and obedient. Vlad agreed to all of it. What choice did he have? But in his heart, he was still the dragon's son, still determined to reclaim what had been taken from him. He had waited 12 years. He could be patient a little longer. In 1476, with Hungarian backing, Vlad returned to Wallachia one final time. He was 45 years old now, no longer the young warrior who had once struck terror into the Ottoman army. But he still had his cunning, his determination, his refusal to accept defeat. He defeated the forces arrayed against him and took the throne for the third time. But this final reign would last only 2 months. 2 months of trying to restore order, to rebuild his shattered country, to prepare for the inevitable Ottoman response, and then, in December of 1476, in a small skirmish near Bucharest, Vlad Dracula was killed. The exact circumstances of his death are unclear, Papa Andrei continued softly. Some say he was killed by Ottoman assassins disguised as his own soldiers. Some say it was his own boyars who finally took their revenge. Some say he died in honest combat, fighting to the end as he had lived. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that his head was cut from his body and sent to Constantinople as a gift for Sultan Mehmed. It was displayed on a stake, a final humiliation for the prince who had humiliated the Sultan's army. His body, according to tradition, was buried at Snagov Monastery on an island in a lake north of Bucharest, though when archaeologists excavated the supposed grave in the 20th century, they found no body, only the bones of horses. Where Vlad truly lies, if anywhere, remains a mystery. But death was not the end for Vlad Dracula. In some ways, it was only the beginning. For while the man died on that December day in 1476, the legend was just being born, and that legend would grow and transform over the centuries, until it became something that would have amazed and perhaps horrified the historical Vlad. In Romania, Vlad was remembered as a hero, harsh but just, a defender of the people against both foreign invaders and corrupt nobles. Folk songs were sung about him. Stories were told around winter fires. He became a symbol of resistance, of the small standing firm against the mighty, of the will to be free no matter the cost. But in Western Europe the image was very different. There, Vlad was remembered as Dracula, the cruel prince, the impaler, the monster from the east. The German pamphlets continued to circulate, their stories growing darker and more fantastic with each retelling. And then, in the oral traditions of Romania and surrounding lands, another element entered the legend. Vampires, the undead, the strigoi who rise from their graves to feed on the living. Romania has always had rich folklore about such creatures, stories that go back centuries before Vlad was born. But somehow, over time, the historical prince and the vampire legends began to merge, to become intertwined in the popular imagination. Who can say exactly? Perhaps it was the stories of Vlad's cruelty, his love of blood and impalement. Perhaps it was the mystery of his burial, the empty grave at Snagov. Perhaps it was simply that Vlad had been so fierce, so seemingly unkillable in life, that people imagined he must have been something more than human, or something less. Whatever the reason, by the time centuries had passed, the historical Vlad and the vampire legend were thoroughly mixed together in folklore and imagination. And then in 1897, 421 years after Vlad's death, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker published a novel that would make the name Dracula famous throughout the entire world. But that, my friends, is where we must pause again. For the story of how Vlad became the vampire count of legend, how Bram Stoker created the modern Dracula, and what this means for how we remember history that deserves its own telling. And I find that my throat is dry, and my old bones are weary. So let us rest a moment, refresh ourselves, and then I will tell you the final part of the tale. The part where a 15th century prince becomes a 19th century vampire, and how the legend of Dracula spread from this small corner of Romania to every corner of the world. The fire crackled softly, and outside the rain had finally stopped, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves and the whisper of wind through the mountain pines. Papa Andrei accepted a plate of bread and cheese from Ilona, and the other travelers helped themselves as well. The common room of the Golden Bear Inn had taken on the quality of a place outside of time, a warm bubble of light and story suspended in the darkness of the Carpathian night. The storm had passed completely now, and through the windows, stars could be seen glittering in the clear sky between the last of the clouds. Now, we must jump forward in time, he said, his voice taking on a different tone, less of the ancient storyteller and more of a teacher explaining mysteries. We must travel from 1476, when Vlad died, forward through the centuries. We must see how a Romanian prince became the most famous vampire in the world. For hundreds of years after his death, Vlad was remembered differently by different peoples. Here in Romania, in Wallachia and Transylvania, he remained a hero of sorts. Oh, people knew he had been cruel, that he had killed without mercy. But they also remembered that he had defended the land against the Ottomans, that he had brought order to chaos, that he had stood up to the most powerful empire in the world and had not bowed. Folk songs were sung about him at weddings and festivals. Stories were told to children about the strong prince who punished the wicked and protected the innocent. In these stories, his cruelty was justified, even celebrated. The merchants and thieves he impaled were shown as villains who got what they deserved. The boyars he killed were traitors. The Ottomans he fought were invaders. Vlad was harsh, yes, but he was their harsh prince defending their land. Exactly, Papa Andrei agreed, and there was truth in this image. Vlad had fought for Romania's independence. He had resisted being anyone's puppet. These were things worth remembering, worth honoring. But in Western Europe, the image was very different, shaped by those German pamphlets we spoke of earlier. To the Germans and Austrians, Vlad was a monster, a cautionary tale about what happens when power is not tempered by mercy. The pamphlets were reprinted again and again over the centuries, each edition adding new horrors to the collection. By the 17th century, Vlad Dracula had become a stock villain in European literature, a symbol of cruelty and evil. But here is where the vampire enters our story. You must understand that belief in vampires is very old in this part of the world. Long before Vlad was born, the people of Romania believed in the strigoi, the undead who rise from their graves to feed on the living. These creatures were feared in every village. Precautions were taken against them. Garlic was hung over doors. Bodies were buried with coins on their eyes or stakes through their hearts to keep them from rising. These beliefs did not come from nowhere. They arose from very real fears in a harsh world. When plague swept through a village, killing dozens, people needed an explanation that made sense to them. When bodies decomposed in certain ways, swelling and releasing gases, appearing almost alive in the grave, people saw evidence of the undead. The strigoi were a way to understand and cope with death and disease in a time before science could explain these things. Now, Vlad was never associated with vampires during his lifetime, or for several centuries after his death. He was remembered as a cruel ruler, yes, but a living one. The vampire connection came much later, perhaps in the 18th century, when the two legends began to merge in folk tradition. There were several reasons for this merging. First, there was Vlad's name, Dracula, the son of the dragon, the son of the devil. In Romanian folklore, the devil and vampires were often connected. Second, there were the stories of his cruelty, his love of blood, his drinking wine among the impaled bodies. These stories, true or exaggerated, linked him with bloodshed in people's minds. Third, there was the mystery of his burial. The empty grave at Snagov suggested he had not found rest, that perhaps he still walked the earth. And fourth, most importantly, Vlad had been so fierce, so seemingly unkillable in life, that it seemed natural to imagine he might have conquered death itself. A man who had defied the Sultan, who had driven back armies, who had ruled through terror. Surely such a man would not simply die and be forgotten. Surely he must still be out there somewhere, in the darkness, waiting. By the time the 19th century arrived, these various legends had thoroughly mixed together in the minds of many Europeans. Transylvania and Wallachia were seen as mysterious, dangerous lands where anything might happen. When Western travelers came here, they saw the mountains and forests and ancient castles, and they imagined all sorts of dark things. Every ruined fortress might hide a vampire. Every mist-shrouded valley might conceal horrors. And then, in the 1890s, came an Irishman who had never visited Romania, but who had read everything he could find about it. His name was Abraham Stoker, called Bram by his friends. He was a theatre manager in London, a successful man, but not particularly famous. He dreamed of writing a novel that would make his name, a story that would thrill and terrify readers. Stoker became fascinated by vampire legends. He read everything he could find about them, studied folklore from across Europe, and at some point in his research, he came across references to Vlad Dracula, the impaler Prince of Wallachia. The name caught his attention. Dracula. What a perfect name for a vampire. It sounded foreign and menacing. It meant dragon or devil. It had history and weight to it. So Stoker began to research Vlad. He read about the cruelty, the impalement, the war with the Ottomans. He read about Transylvania with its mountains and castles and dark forests. And in his imagination he began to weave these real historical elements together with vampire folklore to create something new. Not the historical Vlad, not the traditional strigoi, but something that combined elements of both into a new kind of monster. In 1897, Stoker published his novel, Dracula. The book told the story of Count Dracula, an ancient vampire who lives in a castle in Transylvania and travels to England to spread his curse. This Dracula was an aristocrat, educated and sophisticated, but also a monster who feeds on human blood and commands the creatures of the night. He could transform into a bat or wolf. He could not be seen in mirrors. He could be killed only by specific means. A stake through the heart, beheading holy water. Stoker's Dracula had very little in common with the historical Vlad. The Count in the novel was hundreds of years old. He was supernatural, undead, a creature of magic and nightmare. He was not a defender of Christendom, but an enemy of it, not a prince fighting for his people, but a monster preying on humanity. But Stoker used just enough real details. The name Dracula, the location in Transylvania, vague references to fighting the Turks, to make it all seem connected to the historical figure. The novel was not an immediate success, but over the years it grew in popularity. And when the age of cinema arrived, when movies began to be made, Dracula became one of the most filmed stories in history. Every generation has had its Dracula film, its vampire count. And with each film, each retelling, the legend grew further from the historical truth. Today, if you ask someone anywhere in the world who Dracula was, they will tell you he was a vampire. Very few will know that he was a real person, a prince who lived and died fighting for his country. The legend has completely overwhelmed the history. Vlad the man has been lost beneath Dracula the vampire. Perhaps it is. But it is also the way of legends, the way stories work. History remembers what serves its purposes. The West needed a monster to represent the dangerous, mysterious East, and Vlad's story provided the perfect foundation for that monster. Romania needed a hero who stood against oppression, and Vlad's story provided that too. Both images are true in their way, and both are false. What is interesting is how Romania has responded to all of this. For much of the 20th century, particularly under the communist government, officials tried to distance themselves from the vampire legend. They promoted Vlad as a national hero, a fighter for independence, and were embarrassed by the Dracula connection. They saw it as Western mockery, turning their hero into a monster. But then came the fall of communism and the rise of tourism. Suddenly, officials realized that people from all over the world wanted to come to Romania because of Dracula. They wanted to see the castles, walk the mountains, visit the supposedly haunted places. And tourists bring money. So now, you will find Dracula souvenirs in every gift shop in Transylvania. Hotels claim to be the place where Dracula slept. Castles that Vlad never visited are marketed as Dracula's castle. In economic terms, yes, Papa Andrei agreed. Dracula tourism brings millions of visitors to Romania every year. It has become part of our identity, for better or worse. We embrace the legend while also trying to educate people about the historical reality. It is a strange balance. The most famous example is Bran Castle. This is a beautiful fortress in the mountains near Brasov, not far from here. It is a magnificent building, truly spectacular, with towers and courtyards and secret passages. Tourists from around the world visit it as Dracula's castle. They take photographs. They imagine the vampire count stalking through its halls. But here is the truth. Vlad probably never lived in Bran Castle. He may have passed through it once or twice, nothing more. His real fortress was Poenari Castle, the one he forced the boyars to rebuild after the Easter feast. Poenari is a ruin now, barely accessible, clinging to a cliff high in the mountains. It is the real Dracula's castle, but few tourists go there because it is difficult to reach, and there is not much left to see. So we sell the legend because that is what people want. They do not want to hear about the real Vlad, the complicated man who did terrible things for reasons he believed were justified. They want the vampire count, the romantic dark figure who haunts the night. And who are we to deny them their fantasy, especially when it brings prosperity to our villages? But there is a cost to this, I think. When the legend becomes more famous than the truth, when the vampire overshadows the man, we lose something important. We lose the complexity of history, the difficult questions about justice and cruelty, about ends and means, about what it costs to survive in a brutal world. We lose the chance to learn from the past because we are too busy being entertained by a fictional version of it. This is why I tell the story the way I do, starting with the history before moving to the legend. I want people to understand that Dracula was not just a name Bram Stoker invented. He was a real person who lived in real times, who faced real choices and made real decisions. He was not a supernatural monster. He was a human being, which in some ways is more frightening because it means that the cruelty he committed was human cruelty, the kind that any person might be capable of given the right circumstances. So that is how Vlad Dracula became the vampire count, how a 15th century prince became a 19th century monster, how history became legend. It is a transformation that says as much about us, about what we need from our stories, as it does about Vlad himself. We turn the uncomfortable truth of history into the comfortable fiction of legend. We make monsters out of men, and heroes out of monsters, depending on what lesson we want to teach, or what fear we want to explore. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the world needs its legends and myths as much as it needs its history books. Perhaps we need to believe in vampires and dragons, in absolute evil that can be defeated with a stake and a prayer, because the real evils of the world, the casual cruelties and ordinary betrayals and small compromises that lead to great horrors, those are much harder to face and much harder to defeat. But here in the mountains of Transylvania, in villages like this one, we remember both. We remember Vlad the hero and Vlad the monster. We remember the prince who fought the Ottomans and the prince who impaled thousands. We remember the history and we embrace the legend. And on nights like this, when the wind howls and the darkness presses close, we tell the stories and let each listener decide for themselves what truth they find in the tale. Outside, an owl called from the forest, its voice carrying clearly through the still night air. Papa Andrei nodded, as though the owl had confirmed something important. But there is still more to say, more to understand about this strange story. For the question remains, what do we do with such a legacy? How do we hold both the hero and the monster in our minds at once? How do we learn from this history without being paralyzed by it? That, my friends, requires us to dig a bit deeper, to look beneath both the history and the legend, to find the truths that matter. And that is what I will speak of next In the final part of our tale, the candles flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the travelers leaned forward, ready for the conclusion of the long night story. Papa Andrei was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying coals of the fire as though reading something written there in embers and ash. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more reflective, the voice of a man sharing wisdom earned through long years of living and thinking. "My friends," he began, "we have traveled a long road tonight. From the birth of a prince in Sigishora to his transformation into a vampire legend known throughout the world, we have seen cruelty and courage, betrayal and loyalty, history and myth all tangled together like the roots of an old tree. And now we must ask ourselves, what does it all mean? What are we to make of Vlad Dracula? The easy answer is to make him into one thing or the other. To say he was a hero, a defender of his people who did what was necessary in terrible times. Or to say he was a monster, a cruel tyrant who took pleasure in suffering. Both of these answers are simple and satisfying. Both of them are wrong. Vlad Dracula was complicated, as all real people are. He was capable of great courage and great cruelty. He could be brilliant and foolish. He defended his people by destroying them. He saved his country by devastating it. He was shaped by terrible circumstances, and he shaped terrible circumstances in turn. To understand him, we must understand the world he lived in, and that world was nothing like ours. The priest leaned forward. "You speak of understanding, but surely some acts are beyond understanding. Surely impaling thousands of people cannot be justified by any circumstance." Papa Andrei nodded slowly. "You are right, Father, and yet also not quite right. Let me try to explain. I am not saying Vlad's cruelty was good or justified in any absolute sense. I am saying that to understand why he did what he did, we must look at the context of his time, and that context was very different from our own. First, consider the world Vlad lived in. This was the 15th century. Life was harsh and short for most people. Violence was common. Justice was swift and brutal. Public executions were entertainment. Torture was an accepted part of legal procedure. Every ruler in Europe, Christian and Muslim alike, used terror as a tool of governance. The question was not whether to be cruel, but how cruel to be and to whom. In this context, Vlad's impalement was extreme, but not unique. Other rulers impaled prisoners. Other rulers committed massacres. Other rulers used terror to maintain power. What made Vlad different was the scale of it, the systematic way he applied these methods, and the fact that he did it to his own nobility as well as to foreign enemies. But the methods themselves were not his invention. He learned them from the Ottomans, from the Hungarians, from the traditions of medieval justice. Yes and no, Papa Andrei replied. He was shaped by his time, certainly, but he also made choices within those times. Other rulers in similar situations made different choices. Vlad's brother Radu chose cooperation with the Ottomans over resistance. Other Romanian princes chose to bend rather than break. Vlad chose a path of absolute resistance and absolute terror. That was his choice, and he bears responsibility for it. But here is what I think is important to understand. Vlad believed, genuinely believed, that he was doing what was necessary to save his country. He had seen what happened when rulers were weak. His father had tried compromise and had been murdered. His brother had been buried alive. He himself had been imprisoned twice, betrayed again and again. All of this taught him that mercy was weakness and weakness was death. So he became what he thought he needed to be. He became the dragon, the monster that everyone feared too much to challenge. He thought that if he was cruel enough, strong enough, terrible enough, no one would dare betray him, no one would dare invade, and his country would be safe. And for a time, it worked. He brought order to chaos. He drove back the Ottomans. He made Wallachia strong. The merchant from Budapest stood stretching. Thank you, Papa Andrei, for the shelter, the food, and especially for the story. It was not what I expected, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. But there was a cost, and that cost was his own humanity and the humanity of his country. You cannot build a lasting peace on foundations of terror. You cannot create a just society through injustice. The methods Vlad used corrupted everything they touched. They made enemies of potential allies. They taught people to fear rather than to love. They created a legacy of bitterness that lasted generations. This is the tragedy of Vlad Dracula. He sacrificed everything, including his own soul, for a cause he believed in, and in the end, he failed anyway. The Ottomans conquered Wallachia after his death. His brother ruled in submission to the Sultan. His methods did not save his country. They only made its suffering more dramatic, and its fall more complete. It is, Papa Andrei agreed gently. It is a sad story, but it is also an important one because it teaches us about the dangers of believing that ends justify means, that we can do evil in service of good, that we can become monsters to fight monsters without losing ourselves in the process. Now, what about us? Here in Romania today, how do we hold this history? This is complicated too. On the one hand, Vlad was genuinely a defender of Romania against foreign conquest. He stood up to an empire that could have crushed him like an insect. He showed courage and determination that still inspire people today. These things are worth remembering and honoring. But on the other hand, we cannot ignore or excuse his cruelty. We cannot pretend that impaling thousands of people was somehow noble or necessary. We cannot let nationalism blind us to the reality of what he did. A hero can also be a monster. Both things can be true at once. This is hard for people to accept. We want our heroes pure and our villains evil. We want simple stories with clear lessons. But real history is not simple. Real people are not simple. Vlad was both defender and destroyer. He was both necessary and terrible. He saved lives and took lives. He fought for freedom while denying it to others. Papa Andrei smiled slightly. Carefully, with nuance. By teaching them to think rather than to simply accept. We tell them that Vlad defended Romania, and this was brave and important. We also tell them that he was cruel, and this was wrong and harmful. We teach them that people are complicated, that history is complicated, and that we must learn to hold these contradictions in our minds if we want to truly understand the past. And we teach them to ask questions. Why did Vlad become so cruel? What circumstances led him to believe such methods were necessary? What choices did he have? What might have happened if he had chosen differently? These are the questions that help us learn from history rather than just memorizing it. Because here is the real lesson of Vlad Dracula. It is not that he was good or evil, hero or monster. The real lesson is about what happens when people believe that violence is the only answer, that cruelty is strength, that fear is respect. The real lesson is about how easy it is to justify terrible things when we convince ourselves that we are defending something important. This lesson matters today as much as it did 500 years ago. We still see rulers who use terror to maintain power. We still see people who justify cruelty in the name of security or order or national pride. We still see the same patterns Vlad followed. The belief that we must become monsters to fight monsters, that we must abandon humanity to save it. And the lesson is also about how legends work, how we transform complicated reality into simple stories that serve our needs. We made Vlad into a vampire because it was easier to fear a supernatural monster than to confront the reality of human evil. We made him into a national hero because we needed symbols of resistance. Both transformations avoid the hard work of actually understanding what happened and why. Yes, Papa Andrei agreed. Exactly, yes. The vampire Dracula is entertaining, but ultimately meaningless. The historical Vlad is difficult and troubling, but important. We must look at him clearly, without romance or excuse, and ask ourselves what his story teaches us about power and violence, about justice and cruelty, about the costs of survival and the price of victory. And we must remember that he was not unique. History is full of rulers like Vlad, people who did terrible things for reasons they believed were good. Some succeeded and some failed. Some are remembered as heroes and some as villains. The difference often has less to do with what they actually did than with who won the wars and who wrote the histories afterward. In the end, what do we make of Vlad Dracula? We remember him as a man of his times who was more extreme than most, who faced impossible choices and made terrible decisions, who defended his country but destroyed it in the process. We remember him as someone who shows us both what we are capable of at our bravest and what we are capable of at our worst. We remember him as a warning and as an inspiration, as a hero and as a cautionary tale. And we remember that he was human. Just human, not a vampire or a demon or a supernatural monster. Just a man who lived and died, who made choices and faced consequences, who tried to do what he thought was right, and discovered too late that the path to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. The fire had burned down to almost nothing now. Just a few glowing coals casting barely any light. The candles had melted low in their holders. Outside, the night was deep and still, the storm long past. Here in Romania, Papa Andrei said softly, we live with this complicated legacy every day. We see the tourists coming to visit Dracula's castle. We see our own people debating whether Vlad was hero or villain. We see how the legend has grown beyond all proportion to the reality. and we try to hold on to some truth in the middle of all the myth and propaganda and entertainment. It is not easy, but it is important, because if we forget the real Vlad, if we let him be completely consumed by the vampire legend, then we lose the chance to learn from his story. We lose the warning about what happens when we embrace cruelty in the name of security. We lose the example of how even the brave and determined can go terribly wrong. We lose the complicated, difficult, important truth. So we tell the stories, all of them, the history and the legend, the cruelty and the courage, the hero and the monster. We tell them around fires on stormy nights. We tell them to travelers who come seeking mysteries. We tell them to our children and grandchildren, and we hope that in the telling some wisdom might emerge, some understanding that will help us avoid making the same mistakes that Vlad made. This is the truth beneath the legend of Dracula, not a vampire who drinks blood and fears the cross, not a simple hero who saved his people, but a complicated, flawed, fascinating man who lived in complicated, difficult times, who made choices that still echo through the centuries, who became a legend because we needed legends more than we needed truth. But perhaps that is enough philosophy for one night. The hour is late, and you all must be weary from your travels and from listening to an old man talk for so long. Let us end our story with something gentler, something that will help you sleep peacefully despite all the darkness we have discussed. Let us return to the present, to this inn, to this warm fire, and remember that we are safe and the storm has passed, and the night, for all its darkness, also holds beauty and peace. The coals in the fireplace pulsed with a soft red glow like a sleeping heart, and Papa Andrei's voice grew drowsy and warm, preparing to guide his listeners gently towards sleep. Papa Andrei looked around the common room of the Golden Bear Inn. The travelers, who had arrived hours ago, cold and frightened from the storm, now sat warm and comfortable, their eyes heavy with the lateness of the hour and the weight of the story they had heard. The fire had burned down to its last coals. The candles guttered in their holders. Outside the night was deep and peaceful, the storm nothing but a memory. Indeed, through the small windows of the inn, the night sky could be seen clear and brilliant with stars. The moon had risen just past full, casting silver light over the village and the mountains beyond. It was beautiful, peaceful, a night that held no threat, only the quiet promise of rest and renewal. Papa Andrei stood slowly, his old joints creaking, and walked to the window. He looked out at the familiar sight of his village, at the mountains rising dark against the starlit sky, at the world he had known all his life. 500 years ago, he said quietly, Vlad Dracula walked these same mountains. He saw these same stars, he breathed this same air. The world changes, empires rise and fall, legends grow and transform, but the mountains remain, the stars remain, and we remain telling our stories, trying to understand what came before so we might do better in what comes after. You came here seeking the castle of Dracula, seeking vampires and dark magic and Gothic romance, and I hope I have not disappointed you too much by telling you instead about a real man in real times, because the truth, I think, is more fascinating than any fiction. The truth shows us what we actually are, what we are capable of, both terrible and wonderful. Tomorrow, when you continue your travels, you will see many things marketed as Dracula's this and Dracula's that. Castles he never visited, restaurants serving Dracula's feast, shops selling vampire souvenirs. Do not be too cynical about this. It is simply commerce, the way small places survive in a big world. Buy the souvenirs if they please you. Visit the castles, for they are beautiful regardless of who lived in them. Take your photographs, but perhaps as you do these things, you will remember the story you heard tonight. You will remember that behind the legend is a history, and behind the history is a human being, complex and flawed and fascinating. You will remember that we should question our legends even as we enjoy them, that we should seek truth even when it is uncomfortable, that we should learn from the past even when its lessons are difficult. And perhaps you will remember that the real monsters are not vampires who fear garlic and crosses. The real monsters are the choices we make, the cruelties we justify, the humanity we sacrifice in pursuit of our goals. These are the things we should truly fear, because these are the things that actually exist in our world. But enough of such heavy thoughts. The night is for rest, not worry. The story is told, and now it is time to sleep. Tomorrow will bring new journeys, new adventures, new stories. But tonight, let us simply be grateful for warmth and safety, and the gift of shared tales. Ilona had appeared from the kitchen, moving quietly to check on the comfort of the guests. Stefan was banking the fire properly for the night, making sure the coals would stay alive until morning when they would be needed again. The inn was settling into its nighttime rhythm, the peaceful hush that comes when day's business is done. I have rooms prepared for all of you, Papa Andrei said. Clean beds, warm blankets, everything you need for a good night's rest. The rain has stopped, but the roads will be muddy tomorrow. You may wish to stay another day. Let the sun dry the paths before you continue your journey. You are welcome here, as long as you wish to stay. One by one the travelers rose from their seats, gathering their belongings, preparing to retire to their rooms. They thanked Papa Andrei, pressed coins into his hand despite his protests, bid each other good night. The young couple went up the stairs arm in arm. The German tourist was still writing in his notebook, trying to capture everything he had heard. The priest lingered a moment longer. Papa Andrei, the priest said quietly, you have given me much to think about. The relationship between truth and legend, between history and story. I will carry these thoughts with me. Papa Andrei clasped the priest's hand. Good father, think on them, pray on them. And when you preach in your church, remember that the truth, even when difficult, is more valuable than comfortable lies. The priest nodded and made his way up the stairs. Soon, only Papa Andrei remained in the common room, along with Stefan, who was finishing his work with the fire, and Ilona, who was collecting the cups and plates. Papa Andrei shook his head. Never. Each telling is different. Each group hears something different in the story, and each time I tell it, I understand it a little better myself. That is the gift of stories, daughter. They are not fixed things. They grow and change with each telling, with each listener, with each year that passes. Besides, he added with a smile, what else would an old innkeeper do on stormy nights but tell stories? It is our purpose to provide shelter from the storm and stories to pass the time. This is what we have always done, what we will always do. I am, he admitted. But it is a good exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes from work well done, from stories well told, from helping people understand the world a little better. He made his way slowly to the stairs, pausing at the bottom to look back one more time at the common room. The fire was just embers now, barely glowing. The candles had been snuffed. The room was dark except for the silvery moonlight coming through the windows. "Sleep well, old room," he whispered. "Sleep well, old stories. We will meet again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. There will always be travelers needing shelter. There will always be storms, and there will always be stories to tell." He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, feeling every one of his 70 years. But he climbed with a smile on his face, content with his life, content with his work, content with the endless cycle of storms and travelers and stories told by firelight. In their rooms, the travelers settled into their beds. The mattresses were stuffed with clean straw and smelled of lavender. The blankets were thick wool, heavy and warm. Through the windows they could see the stars and the moon and the dark shapes of the mountains. The German tourist finished his notes and set his book aside. He blew out his candle and lay in the darkness, thinking about legends and truth, about how stories shape our understanding of the world. Tomorrow he would visit Bran Castle and take photographs, but he would see it differently now, with eyes opened by Papa Andrei's tale. The priest knelt beside his bed and said his evening prayers. He prayed for the souls of the dead, for Vlad and all who had suffered in those long ago times. He prayed for wisdom to understand the difficult truths of history. He prayed for peace, for himself, and for the world. One by one, the travelers drifted into sleep. Their breathing deepened and slowed. Their minds released the day's worries and the night's dark stories. They dreamed of mountains and stars, of castles and forests, of beauty and peace. Outside, the wind moved gently through the village, carrying the scent of pine and rain-washed earth. The moon sailed across the sky, bathing the Carpathian Mountains in silver light. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called and another answered. The world turned slowly on its axis, moving from night toward morning, from darkness toward light. In the Golden Bear Inn, all was quiet. The storm had passed. The stories had been told, and sleep, gentle and healing, wrapped itself around the travelers like a warm blanket, carrying them safely through the darkness toward the promise of a new day. The mountains stood eternal, keeping their watch over the valleys and villages below. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had witnessed countless lives begin and end. They had watched as Vlad Dracula walked their paths 500 years ago, and they had watched every day since. They would stand long after all of us. these travelers and storytellers had turned to dust. But tonight, they simply stood silent in the moonlight, holding their secrets, sheltering the small human lives that flickered briefly in their shadow. The mountains knew all the stories, all the truths, all the legends. They knew where history ended and myth began. But they kept their counsel, speaking only in the language of stone and snow and the deep silence of the earth. And in that silence, in that peace, in that moment between the ending of one story and the beginning of the next, there was rest, there was comfort, there was the gentle promise that morning would come, that the sun would rise, that life would continue, that there would be more stories to tell and more travelers to hear them. Sleep now, dear adventurers. The tale is told. The night is peaceful. The storm has passed. Rest easy in this warm, safe place and let the darkness hold no fear for you. Tomorrow will bring new journeys and new adventures, but tonight, simply rest, simply sleep, simply dream, and know that you are safe here, in this mountain village, in this old inn, under these ancient stars. The story of Dracula has been told, and you have heard it truly. Now let it settle into your memory like snow, settling on the mountains, peaceful and pure and quietly beautiful.